I didn't know the meeting was about me until I saw who was already seated at the table. The CEO at the head. HR to his right. Legal dialed in on the screen. No calendar context, no warning, no time to prepare. Just my name spoken aloud and a chair pulled out for me, like the outcome had already been decided. He didn't waste time. He said the company was moving in a different direction and that my role was no longer aligned with future priorities. The words were polished, rehearsed, and delivered with a confidence that suggested this was routine. Final. Clean. He slid a folder across the table without looking at me, already shifting his attention to the next item on his agenda. I didn't interrupt. I didn't argue. I noticed how quickly HR nodded, how legal stayed silent, how no one mentioned my projects, my systems, or the things only I touched. The CEO thanked me for my contributions and said security would handle the rest. As I stood up, something felt off. Not emotionally, procedurally. The termination was too fast. Too certain. Like he believed every risk had already been accounted for. I handed over my badge, walked out of the room, and let the door close behind me. At that moment, everyone assumed the story was over. They were wrong. Security didn't say much as they walked me back to my desk. They hovered just far enough away to pretend this wasn't humiliating, but close enough to make sure I didn't linger. A few people looked up when they saw me packing my bag. Most didn't. The office had already decided how this would be remembered. Quiet termination, no drama, nothing worth asking about. I logged out of my workstation under supervision. One by one, internal tools kicked me out faster than usual. Email first. Chat second. Then the main dashboard. It was efficient, almost aggressive. Someone had clearly instructed IT to move quickly. That alone told me the CEO didn't want loose ends. But when I tried to log out of the last system, the screen froze. No error. No confirmation. Just a brief pause before returning me to the home interface. The security guard shifted his weight, impatient, but didn't notice. I clicked again. Same result. Done, I said, closing the laptop anyway. They escorted me to the elevator, collected my badge, and wished me luck with rehearsed politeness. As the doors closed, I finally exhaled. Not from shock, but from realization. They'd locked me out of almost everything. Almost. And the one thing they missed wasn't something anyone else knew how to check. By the time I got home, the official email had already arrived. A generic message from HR confirming my termination, outlining final pay, benefits, and next steps. I read it once, then again more slowly. Most of it was boilerplate. Copy-paste language designed to close loops, not start questions. Then I saw the reference code at the bottom. It pointed to an agreement I hadn't thought about in years, something drafted during a system migration everyone treated as temporary. Back then, legal had rushed it through to meet a deadline, and I'd been asked to hold ownership until a full transfer could be completed. That transfer was supposed to happen later. It never did. I opened my personal archive and searched for the document. It was still there. Signed. Executed. Never amended. One clause stood out immediately. It outlined what would happen if my role ended before formal reassignment. At the time, it felt theoretical. A safeguard no one expected to trigger. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the screen. The company thought they'd closed every door. They believed this was clean, contained, finished. They didn't realize their own paperwork had just opened something else entirely. I didn't celebrate or panic. I did what I'd always done when something felt unstable. I traced it. I opened old folders, backups I'd kept out of habit more than intention. Migration notes. Email threads. Redline drafts legal never followed up on. The deeper I went, the clearer it became that the agreement wasn't an anomaly. It was part of a pattern, temporary solutions that became permanent because they worked too well to question. The clause wasn't dramatic. No threats. No penalties. Just a quiet mechanism outlining continuity if stewardship was interrupted. If my role ended without reassignment, control defaulted back to the steward of record. Me. Not ownership in a symbolic sense, operational authority. Access. Approval rights. The kind that sits underneath dashboards executives never open. I checked the timestamps. The termination had already executed, which meant the clock was ticking, not forward, but inward. Processes I designed to protect the company were now protecting something else. My phone buzzed with a message from a former teammate asking if I was okay. I typed a response, then deleted it. This wasn't something to explain yet. Maybe ever. I closed my laptop and sat there, listening to the quiet of my apartment. Somewhere downtown, people were still working late, assuming Monday would arrive like it always did. It wouldn't. The next morning, the company announced my departure in a short internal memo. It thanked me for my service and wished me well. No context. No explanation. Just enough to discourage questions without answering them. By noon, my calendar invites were reassigned and my name disappeared from org charts like it had never been there. I heard later that 3 people were assigned to cover my responsibilities: 2 senior engineers and 1 manager. On paper, it made sense. Between them, they could handle the visible parts of my role. What they couldn't see were the dependencies that didn't belong to any team, only to a person. Around mid-afternoon, I received an automated notification from a third-party platform we'd integrated years ago. It wasn't addressed to the company. It was addressed to me. Primary contact. Steward of record. The message was routine, almost boring. A confirmation request related to continuity. Something that normally required a quick acknowledgement and nothing more. I didn't respond. Inside the company, no alarms went off. Not yet. Everything looked stable from the surface. Leadership assumed the transition was complete. They didn't know a system they relied on was waiting for an answer only one person could give. That evening, my phone lit up with a message from someone I hadn't heard from in months. A former colleague. Not close, but observant. The kind of person who noticed patterns without announcing them. Hey, the message read. Something weird just happened in prod. Sync failed. They're saying it's a vendor issue. I stared at the screen longer than necessary. The system he was talking about didn't fail randomly. It never had. Not because it was perfect, but because it had been designed with one assumption baked into every layer: continuity of stewardship. I typed back carefully. Which sync? He replied with the name of the integration I'd personally overseen. The one everyone forgot about because it only became visible when it broke. According to him, leadership was calm. Confident. The CEO had already told the room it was nothing structural. That confidence told me more than the failure itself. They didn't know where to look yet. I set my phone down and thought back to the last time that sync had stalled. Years ago. During testing. Back when legal had insisted on safeguards, just in case. Safeguards no one revisited once things stabilized. I didn't feel satisfaction. Just confirmation. Whatever had started was moving quietly, exactly as designed. And no one inside the company was watching the right place. The next morning, I pulled up the original architecture diagrams. Not the polished versions used in presentations, but the working drafts, the ones full of comments, caveats, and assumptions people were supposed to revisit later. I remembered why I'd built the system the way I had. It wasn't about performance or elegance. It was about separation. At the time, the company was growing too fast. Acquisitions, partnerships, rushed integrations. Ownership lines blurred easily. Legal wanted flexibility. Engineering wanted speed. Someone needed to hold the center. So stewardship became the compromise. A role, not a title. Authority without visibility. Control without attention. It allowed the system to function while contracts caught up. Or so they'd said. I followed the dependencies outward. Every critical path traced back to a single authorization layer. One that didn't belong to IT. Or finance. Or even legal. It belonged to the steward. Me. I checked the logs. The reversion process hadn't completed yet, but it had started. Quietly. Automatically. Just as outlined in the agreement no one remembered signing. Inside the company, they were still troubleshooting symptoms. Looking at dashboards. Calling vendors. They hadn't realized the problem wasn't technical. It was structural. Late that afternoon, an email landed in my personal inbox from an address I recognized instantly. A third-party partner we'd integrated during a rushed expansion phase. Their messages were usually filtered through internal channels, routed to shared inboxes and distribution lists. This one wasn't. It was addressed directly to me. The tone was polite, professional, and slightly uncertain. They were following up on a continuity check tied to a critical service dependency. According to their records, I was still listed as the primary authority of record. They wanted to confirm whether the recent organizational change had been formally approved on my end. I read the email twice. They weren't asking for permission. They were asking for confirmation. I didn't reply. Inside the company, no one would have seen this message. It wouldn't trigger alerts or dashboards. It sat outside the internal ecosystem, governed by agreements signed long before new leadership arrived. Agreements that treated stewardship as a constant, not a role tied to employment status. By ignoring the email, I wasn't causing anything. I was allowing a process to continue exactly as written. Somewhere in a conference room, someone was probably saying the situation was under control, that vendors were being contacted, that the issue would resolve itself. They didn't know the only response that mattered wasn't coming from inside the building. That night, I pulled up the full contract trail tied to the asset. Not summaries. Not slide decks. The actual sequence of agreements, amendments, and side letters that accumulated over years of temporary decisions. It took time to reconstruct, but the path was there. One document stood out immediately. A transfer agreement that was never finalized. The company had assumed ownership through usage, not completion. Legal had flagged it once, then moved on when nothing broke. At the time, it felt harmless. Everything worked. But the agreement had conditions. Deadlines. Explicit language around what happened if stewardship ended before formal reassignment and transfer were complete. The reversion wasn't optional. It was automatic. I checked the dates. The transfer window had expired quietly years ago. No extensions filed. No waivers signed. The company had been operating on assumption alone. And assumption doesn't hold up under scrutiny. I closed the document and sat back, the weight of it settling in. This wasn't about a system failure or a missed approval. It was about something much larger that had been overlooked because it never caused immediate pain. Until now. They thought firing me removed risk. In reality, it activated it. By Monday morning, the tone inside the company shifted. I didn't need to be there to feel it. My former colleague texted again, shorter this time. Meetings were being scheduled and canceled within minutes. A planned deployment was quietly postponed with no explanation. Leadership told the teams it was out of an abundance of caution, which was corporate language for uncertainty. The CEO, I was told, addressed the situation directly. He assured everyone the issue was isolated and temporary. That external partners were being coordinated with. That nothing critical was at risk. His confidence hadn't cracked yet. It was the kind of confidence that comes from believing you understand the full map. But the symptoms kept spreading. Not failures, hesitations. Systems waiting for confirmations that never arrived. Automated processes pausing at checkpoints no one remembered existed. Each pause triggered a workaround. Each workaround added delay. From the outside, it still looked manageable. From the inside, people were starting to notice that fixes weren't sticking. Something deeper was resisting intervention. I watched it unfold from a distance, not with satisfaction, but with a strange calm. This was exactly how it was supposed to happen. Quietly. Incrementally. Without alarms. The system wasn't breaking. It was waiting. And the longer it waited, the fewer options leadership would have left. Late that afternoon, legal sent out a request for archived materials. Not unusual on its own, but the scope was. They were asking for documents going back 5 years, tied to the original integration and asset onboarding. Most of the people receiving the request hadn't even been at the company that long. My former teammate mentioned it offhandedly. They're pulling everything, he said. Old drafts too. Stuff no one's opened in years. That caught my attention. Those drafts weren't just historical. They contained context. Assumptions. Notes explaining why certain shortcuts were taken and who was meant to follow up. And many of them had been written by me, back when the system was still being shaped instead of maintained. Legal, apparently, Couldn't find the final appendix to one of the key agreements. The one that clarified stewardship and transfer conditions. The one everyone assumed existed but no one had actually checked. I knew exactly where it was. I'd saved it myself after legal missed a filing deadline and asked me to hold on to it for now. That was years ago. Long enough for everyone to forget. Inside the company, frustration was growing. Questions were being asked that didn't have quick answers. And the deeper legal dug, the closer they were getting to a conclusion no one was ready to face. That evening, my phone rang from a number I didn't recognize. I let it go to voicemail. A minute later, a second call came in. Same number. I still didn't answer. When the voicemail notification appeared, I listened carefully. The caller introduced herself as someone from compliance. Not HR. Not legal. Compliance almost never reached out directly unless something had already crossed an internal threshold. Her message was measured, cautious. She said they were conducting a routine review connected to a legacy asset and needed to confirm whether I was still affiliated in any capacity. The phrasing mattered. She didn't ask if I worked there. She asked if I was affiliated. I didn't return the call. Instead, I pulled up the compliance framework we'd built years earlier, back when regulations were tightening and leadership wanted to show proactive governance. Stewardship was mentioned there too, embedded in language about continuity and accountability. It wasn't flashy, but it was binding. Inside the company, compliance operated independently. They didn't take direction from the CEO. Once they opened a review, it followed its own path. By not responding, I wasn't being evasive. I was letting the record speak for itself. Somewhere in the building, a line had been crossed from inconvenience into scrutiny. And scrutiny doesn't care about confidence. The next morning, internal dashboards began flagging anomalies. Not failures. Not outages. Status changes. Processes that had always resolved themselves were now stuck in pending states, waiting for validation that never came. Engineers tried manual overrides. Managers approved exceptions. Nothing moved forward. That's when the reversion process crossed its first internal milestone. It wasn't dramatic. No alerts went off. No one was notified. The system simply began honoring the rules that had always existed beneath the surface. Authority checks resolved differently. Permissions evaluated against a different source of truth. The shift was subtle enough that most people wouldn't notice unless they were looking directly at the logs. And no one was. The asset wasn't shutting down. It was isolating itself. Dependencies that required confirmation from stewardship were no longer accepting internal approvals. From the system's perspective, the company no longer met the criteria to act unilaterally. Inside leadership meetings, frustration turned to concern. Teams reported that fixes weren't holding. That each workaround introduced a new delay somewhere else. Someone suggested a deeper audit. Someone else suggested waiting it out. They still believed this was technical. They didn't realize the system was behaving exactly as instructed. It wasn't malfunctioning. It was reverting. By midweek, the issue had climbed high enough that it could no longer be contained within engineering. A board member requested a formal review of the asset status, framed as a precaution rather than a response. That detail mattered. Precautions happen before blame. Responses happen after. What caught everyone off guard was how the review was initiated. It didn't come through the CEO. It didn't come through legal. It came directly from the board's risk committee, citing concerns raised during a routine compliance check. That meant the conversation was no longer about fixes. It was about exposure. Inside the company, the CEO was reportedly irritated but unconcerned. He'd built his authority on decisiveness, and he treated this like another operational snag that would resolve itself once the right people were pushed hard enough. He approved the review without comment, confident it would validate his assumptions. No one thought to loop me in. The review request triggered a cascade of internal document pulls. Ownership records. Authority mappings. Historical approvals. Each department produced its own version of the truth, and none of them fully aligned. Gaps began to appear, small at first, then harder to explain. From the outside, I watched the shift happen. The language changed. Fewer absolutes. More qualifiers. People stopped saying when and started saying if. The board didn't know what they were about to find, but they knew enough to start looking in the wrong places, which meant they were getting closer to the right one. I spent that evening revisiting a decision I hadn't thought about in years. Back when the asset was first being integrated, there'd been a debate about control. Legal wanted ownership centralized. Engineering wanted autonomy. Leadership wanted speed. No one wanted responsibility if something went wrong. Stewardship was the compromise. I hadn't been chosen because of rank or politics. I was chosen because I understood the system end to end and wasn't interested in authority for its own sake. Stewardship wasn't a promotion. It was a safeguard. A way to ensure continuity if leadership changed faster than infrastructure could adapt. The agreement had been explicit. Stewardship survived restructures, reorgs, even terminations, unless and until a formal reassignment was completed and acknowledged by all parties. It wasn't symbolic. It was procedural. I pulled up the original language again. There it was, unchanged. Clearer now than it had ever seemed at the time. What struck me wasn't that the company had forgotten. It was that they'd never truly understood. They'd treated stewardship like a courtesy title, not realizing it was the keystone holding everything together. Inside the company, the board review continued. Questions were being asked that had no clean answers. The CEO was still confident, still certain this would resolve internally. He didn't realize the foundation he was standing on didn't belong to him anymore. And it hadn't for a while. By Thursday, the consequences became impossible to hide. Finance missed a key internal milestone tied to projected revenue, the kind executives usually brushed off as timing noise. This time, they couldn't. The numbers didn't reconcile, and no one could explain why the expected confirmations hadn't cleared. What should have been automatic was still sitting in a pending state. Leadership asked engineering for answers. Engineering pointed to approvals. Approvals pointed to authority mappings. Authority mappings pointed somewhere no one expected. Every path looped back to the same unresolved dependency, like the system was politely refusing to move forward. The CEO reportedly lost patience. He demanded updates, timelines, accountability. Meetings stretched longer. Voices got sharper. Still, no one suggested that the problem might not be fixable from the inside. That assumption held firm. From my side, the pattern was unmistakable. The system wasn't escalating errors. It was withholding certainty. Every safeguard was doing exactly what it was designed to do when stewardship became unclear. The missed milestone triggered questions from outside the company. Partners wanted reassurances. Forecasts were quietly adjusted. Confidence began to leak, not publicly, but internally, where it mattered most. They still believed this was a temporary obstruction. They didn't realize they were watching the cost of assumption compound in real time. And the longer it went unresolved, the fewer options remained. That night, legal finally located the missing appendix. It wasn't where they expected it to be, which should have been the first red flag. By the time someone thought to check archived personal files tied to former stewards, the window had already closed. The clause had executed days earlier, quietly and completely. The language was unambiguous. Upon termination without formal reassignment, stewardship reverted automatically. No approval required. No intervention allowed. Once triggered, the process completed independently of internal intent. Legal flagged it immediately, escalating the finding up the chain. What they didn't say out loud, what they couldn't yet confirm, was that the reversion wasn't theoretical anymore. It had already happened. Inside the company, panic didn't erupt. Not yet. First came disbelief. Then reinterpretation. Then the search for exceptions that didn't exist. Lawyers argued semantics. Engineers double-checked logs. Executives asked whether the clause could be challenged retroactively. It couldn't. From the system's perspective, the question of authority had already been answered. Control had shifted cleanly, exactly as documented years ago and never amended. By the time leadership realized what the appendix actually meant, the damage wasn't operational. It was positional. And there was no rollback for that. By Friday morning, the CEO was no longer confident. That much was obvious from the way decisions stalled instead of landing. Requests went out and came back unanswered. Meetings were called without agendas. People spoke carefully, like they were afraid of saying the wrong thing in front of the wrong person. I heard later that he demanded a closed-door explanation from legal and engineering together. Not updates, answers. He wanted to know how a system he'd been assured was secure had effectively stopped responding to internal authority. No one could give him a straight line from cause to fix. That was when someone finally said my name. Not loudly. Not formally. More like a question that slipped out before it could be stopped. Wasn't Laura involved in this originally? The room went quiet after that. It's easy to ignore someone when you believe they're gone. It's much harder when you realize they might still be relevant. The CEO asked whether I could be brought back in as a consultant. Legal didn't answer immediately. They were still reading. Still realizing that this wasn't a technical dependency, it was a structural one. For the first time since the meeting where I was fired, the CEO understood something fundamental had been misjudged. He hadn't removed a variable. He'd activated one. The email arrived that afternoon. Not from the CEO. Not from HR. It came from legal, carefully worded, and deliberately neutral. They said they were seeking clarification on certain historical arrangements and wondered if I might be available to discuss them. There was no mention of urgency. No apology. No explanation of why they needed me now. Just a suggestion that a conversation might be mutually beneficial. I didn't respond. An hour later, another email followed. This one acknowledged that my termination had complicated matters and that leadership was reassessing the situation. Still no specifics. Still no admission of what had actually happened. From what I was told later, the CEO was pacing, demanding timelines, asking whether the board had been notified yet. Legal advised caution. Compliance was already involved. Nothing could be rushed anymore. By not answering, I wasn't withholding information. I was allowing the process to complete without interference. The system didn't need my intervention to keep reverting. It only needed time. That silence unsettled them more than any response could have. It forced leadership to confront the possibility that control had already left their hands. And for the first time, they were reacting instead of directing. They just didn't know how far the shift had already gone. By the following week, the board stepped in directly. Expansion plans that had been announced with confidence were suddenly paused, framed as strategic reconsiderations. No one used the word halt, but that's what it was. Without the asset functioning as expected, timelines stopped making sense. Deals couldn't close. Forecasts couldn't be defended. What made it worse was that no one could explain the pause without admitting uncertainty. The CEO could command teams, but he couldn't command clarity. Every question the board asked uncovered another dependency tied back to this same unresolved authority gap. The more leadership tried to work around it, the more exposed the structure became. Internally, people began whispering. Not about me, but about risk. About how something so foundational could be so poorly understood. About how many assumptions had been layered on top of a single decision no one remembered making. The board requested a full asset dependency map. Not a summary. Not an overview. A complete trace from origin to present control. That request alone changed the tone. It wasn't about fixing a problem anymore. It was about understanding how the problem existed in the first place. Somewhere in that process, the realization began to take shape that this wasn't an operational failure. It was a governance one. And governance failures don't disappear quietly. The audit began 2 days later. External reviewers were brought in under confidentiality, given full access to records leadership had never revisited. They didn't look at performance metrics or uptime reports. They looked at authority, at signatures, at names attached to responsibilities that had never been formally transferred. That's when my name surfaced, not as a former employee, but as the final authority of record. The auditors flagged it immediately. According to the documentation, I wasn't just involved historically. I was still listed as the steward tied to the assets control framework. Termination didn't remove that designation. In fact, it triggered the very conditions that reinforced it. The auditors asked a simple question: why was the steward fired without reassignment? No one had an answer. That question made its way to the board, then to legal, Then back to the CEO, who now had to explain a decision he'd treated as routine. The firing was no longer just a personnel matter. It was a governance event with measurable consequences. Inside the company, the narrative shifted again. Quietly, but decisively. People stopped asking how to fix the system and started asking how this had been allowed to happen. And for the first time, the CEO wasn't in control of the conversation. He was subject to it. The CEO learned the truth in fragments, not all at once. First from legal, then from compliance, and finally from the board. Each conversation stripped away another assumption he'd been operating under. The asset wasn't malfunctioning. It wasn't delayed. It wasn't blocked by a vendor or a missed approval. It was behaving exactly as designed. What unsettled him most wasn't the technical explanation. It was the realization that the company had never fully owned what it believed it controlled. Usage had been mistaken for ownership. Authority had been inferred, not confirmed. And the one-person position to bridge that gap had been dismissed without a second thought. The CEO asked whether this could be fixed internally. Legal didn't answer right away. When they did, their response was careful. The reversion clause had executed. Control had shifted. Reassignment would now require consent, not assumption. That was the moment his confidence collapsed, not publicly, but privately, where it mattered. The decision he'd treated as clean and final had exposed a vulnerability no one could spin away. Firing me hadn't simplified anything. It had removed the illusion holding everything together. Inside the boardroom, the tone changed again. This wasn't about blame anymore. It was about containment. About how to explain a loss of control without admitting negligence. And beneath all of it was a single, unavoidable question the CEO hadn't asked soon enough. What exactly had he fired? The full scope came into focus during the board's closed session later that week. The auditors laid it out plainly, without drama or accusation. Upon my termination, stewardship of the asset had reverted automatically under the terms of an unamended agreement. The process was lawful, documented, and irreversible. The asset wasn't symbolic. It wasn't abstract. It underpinned core systems, revenue channels, and long-term contracts valued at approximately $430 million. Not projected value. Existing exposure. The kind that shaped balance sheets and investor confidence. What stunned the room wasn't the number. It was the simplicity of the mechanism. No action required. No demand made. The system had executed exactly as instructed years ago, when leadership was more concerned with speed than structure. I wasn't present for that meeting, but I was told what happened next. Silence. Not shock. Not anger. Just the quiet recalibration that happens when people realize they've crossed a line they didn't know existed. The board confirmed what legal already understood. Control had shifted back to me by design. Any attempt to override it would create more risk than resolution. Negotiation was now the only path forward. The CEO finally understood what firing me had done. He hadn't removed an employee. He had surrendered leverage. And the company would never look at authority the same way again. By the time the board reached out formally, the tone had shifted completely. There was no urgency in their language, but there was weight. They acknowledged the situation as it was, not as they wished it had been. The asset had reverted. The process was valid. The exposure was real. What remained undecided was how the company would move forward. I was asked to review their findings, not to confirm them. That distinction mattered. They already knew the answer. They needed alignment, not permission. For the first time since I'd been fired, the conversation wasn't about my role or my employment status. It was about governance, continuity, and risk mitigation. What struck me most was how little emotion there was in the exchange. No accusations. No defensiveness. Just a quiet acknowledgement that a line had been crossed years ago and never corrected. The company had grown on top of a foundation it didn't fully understand, and now it had to reckon with that. I didn't rush to respond. There was no advantage in speed anymore. The system had already done its work. Anything I said now would shape outcomes far beyond a single decision or person. Inside the company, the CEO was no longer driving strategy. He was reacting to it. The board had taken control, and their questions weren't about how to undo the past. They were about how to live with it. I never returned to the building. There was no dramatic meeting, no final confrontation, no moment where voices were raised. What happened instead was quieter and far more permanent. The company adjusted. Plans were revised. Assumptions were rewritten. Authority was redefined. What I walked away with wasn't just control of an asset. It was clarity. The realization that power doesn't announce itself. It accumulates in details people overlook, in safeguards written for later, in decisions made when speed feels more important than structure. The CEO eventually stepped back from the narrative he'd created. Publicly, the company framed the situation as a strategic realignment. Privately, they learned a lesson they couldn't unlearn. Firing me hadn't exposed weakness in an employee. It had exposed fragility in leadership. I didn't need to claim victory. The outcome spoke for itself. The system behaved exactly as it was designed to, and the people who underestimated it were forced to adapt. Looking back, the most revealing part wasn't the reversion or the number attached to it. It was how easily confidence had replaced understanding, and how quickly that confidence dissolved when tested. I hadn't planned for things to end this way. I'd planned for continuity. And when that continuity was broken, the truth surfaced on its own.